What pops into your head when you hear the words fast Jaguar? An E-Type? Perhaps an XJ220? An XKRS? An F-Type? Or even an F-Pace? Well, in just a short while from now, a fast Jag is going to mean this.
This is the Jaguar I-Pace. It's the British company's first ever all-electric car, and that's super important because Jaguar is going all-electric very soon, and the I-Pace is our best preview of what future Jaguars are going to be like. But my concern is, can an electric Jaguar be Jaguar enough?
Going by the styling, you'd certainly think so. The I-Pace has that unmistakably Jaguar face and curves, even if its proportions suggest a jacked-up crossover rather than all-out SUV. With no packaging constraints for an IC powertrain, the wheels are pushed right out to the four corners and overhangs are super short. The short stubby hood may not be very Jaguar-like, but it's got curves in all the right places, and the functional aero elements don't look too technical. They actually add to the car's aesthetics. Despite all that and the flat underbody, its 0.29 coefficient of drag doesn't quite compare to something like the Tesla Model X's 0.25 CD. It takes seeing the gorgeous I-Pace in the metal to really appreciate it. Parts like the squared-off tail look a lot less abrupt in person. All said, it definitely looks like nothing else on the road. It's stylish and sporty all at the same time.
It's more good news inside. The cabin doesn't feel too futuristic or too space age. It's actually quite traditionally Jaguar with a very nice two-layered dash and just 3 screens in total, and the screens aren't massively large, and thank God they still are physical dials for stuff like your climate control and your volume. You could probably take a guess as to the seating position just by looking at the car. You're not sat as typically high as in a SUV, but it's not a sedan type seating either. It's a happy compromise in the middle. The one part of the driving experience that will remind you of certain, maybe not as usable Jaguars, is the fact that the rear windscreen is tiny. Though on the flip side, through the rear view mirrors, you can see that rising beltline and those strong haunches, which reminds you that you're driving something special. Now, there are a few things that I wish Jaguar had assigned buttons to, like the active sound design, which actually changes the sound that the car makes under acceleration. The second being the level of brake regeneration, which you can't really do on the move because this car has no paddle shifters. Both of these settings are buried in the menu and at last count require about 5 to 6 button presses to get you what you want.
Adding to the list of minor annoyances, the 360-degree cameras also need a few button presses if you don't want to wait for them to spring into action themselves. Also, the standard fixed panoramic sunroof isn't offered with the sunblind, and despite its infrared absorbing laminate construction, it does let you feel the sun on a sunny day, which means the climate control has to work overtime, eating into precious range. Though, like most modern EVs, you can precondition the car before you drive off, which also warms up the battery for you, so the overall negative effect on range isn't too harsh. Back to the good stuff. Sound installation is pretty good inside the cabin given the I-Pace's near-silent operation, while the optional Meridian 3D surround audio sounds absolutely phenomenal. That near 3-meter long wheelbase does translate into great space at the rear, and you're sat quite comfortably without needing to scrunch your knees up to fit. The boot's pretty large too, and the front trunk or frunk serves as the best storage for charging cables. 6 airbags aside, the I-Pace also has a deployable pedestrian safety airbag, active brake assist, adaptive cruise control, 360-degree cameras, and a pretty trick motor drag control that varies the level of regen braking on a slippery surface to make sure your wheels don't lock up. It'll also make cool electric motor sounds on the outside at speeds up to 20 kmph to warn pedestrians.
Let's get the specs out of the way first, and they're quite Jaguar-like. You've got 400 PS of power, 695 Newton meters of torque that goes to all the 4 wheels. There's an electric motor on the front and one at the back, so you do get all-wheel drive. And the 0 to 100 kmph is in a claimed 4.8 seconds. Again, very exciting, very Jaguar-like figures, and the all-electric driving range is 470 kilometers according to the WLTP test, though a realistic figure is between 300 to 350, but we'll have more on that in a minute. Throttle feels perfectly calibrated at low speeds, so navigating city traffic isn't a chore at all. There are some electric cars that feel like they want to lurch forward, and the Jag doesn't do that. The buttons on the dash cycle you through the drive modes, which go from comfort, eco, to a dedicated off-road driving mode which has such things as a low traction launch, which helps you get off in slippery surfaces so that all that electric torque that's available right from zero doesn't overwhelm the tires and dig you in. Of course, there's also the dynamic drive mode, which firms up the optional air suspension on this car just a little bit to give you that tight body control that makes this feel like a Jaguar. In regular drive modes, when you plant your foot down, you're met with a very spaceship-like sound, but that all changes when you put it into dynamic. And when you put your foot down, it's a lot louder, and it's a mix between a V8 and an electric motor, and it sounds amazing. Of course, all that electric torque is addictive, and I just can't help myself.
Driven flat out, the I-Pace blitzes from standstill to 100 kmph in 5 seconds flat, but its roll-on times were much more impressive at under a second, eclipsing figures we've managed from 600 PS V8 powered performance cars.
The first thing that you'll notice when you set off in, say, comfort mode is just how smoothly the I-Pace rolls down the road. Like I said, this car is fitted with the optional air suspension, but at an estimated rupees 1.5 lakh for air suspension on all 4 corners, I think it's a no-brainer. It can be fitted on any model in the range. And while we haven't driven the steel-sprung car, just the breadth of capabilities that air suspension offers you, I think is worth the asking price. Like we said, that stellar ride quality also comes courtesy of the high-profile tires fitted on these 19-inch wheels. It's something that Jaguar Land Rover does in India, and it's something that should be appreciated, even though it maybe robs the style element of it just a little bit. The payoff in terms of just peace of mind that you can roll over anything and not worry about sidewall tears is, I think, quite unrivaled. Of course, being a Jaguar and one equipped with air suspension at that, it does have a tendency to crash into potholes and over sharp surfaces, but that's something that all air suspension equipped cars do. Driving over joints on the expressway, you do feel a little bit of body movement, but it's so well controlled you almost don't feel like putting it in sport mode. Though I must say, putting it in sport mode does make the whole thing just come alive. Building electric cars is sort of a new art for Jaguar, as it is for a lot of other manufacturers. And this being an entirely new platform, it's really astounding as to how much feel of a Jaguar that they've built into it in the first place. The steering feels just right, like any other Jaguar, and you get just the right amount of feel even when you're pushing it to let you know exactly where the grip is and where the grip is going. Despite these being moderately sized tires and it being a wet road, when you put your foot down, the traction controller is smart enough to give you as much as you need and not any more, so you don't really feel any wheel spin tugging at the wheel. Even with traction control turned off, we saw that the I-Pace doesn't really shift a lot of power to the rear wheels, though there are some times where you do feel the rear kick out just a little bit, so it does have some of that typical Jaguar playfulness in it. It's just not that full-blown, hardcore, crazy tail-out experience. Now, the I-Pace does handle corners remarkably well, considering it's supposed to be an SUV/crossover, and given that its center of gravity is a whole 130 mm lower than Jag's own SUV, the F-Pace, you can understand why it feels so agile and so responsive when you come to a set of corners. Though like any all-wheel drive car, when you really do push it, you do tend to push just a little wide when you enter the corner, with the power then going to the rear wheel to help you rotate and sort yourself out. So in that sense, again, it's a score for the I-Pace because it does drive like a Jaguar should. With the regen braking set in high, one pedal driving is nearly possible until you have to come to a complete halt at, say, a traffic light. And in the low mode, it feels just like a regular car. And actually, the extra regen braking actually helps give the I-Pace its EV identity. What does bring you back down to earth rather quickly is seeing your distance to empty drop quite rapidly when you're making pulls like that. So you learn to appreciate all the comfort that this Jaguar can also give you.
In the short time we had the I-Pace, we managed a round 265-kilometer trip filled with highway runs, testing, shooting, sitting around with the climate control running, and some fun at a car track with about 15% charge left to spare. Going by our mixed highway city test that we conducted separately, we estimate most people will comfortably get over 350 kilometers to a single charge, going up to near 400 kilometers if driven sensibly. As for charging, Jaguar will install a 7.4 kilowatt charger for you at your home or at your office, which will fully charge the I-Pace up in 14 hours. Public charging from 0 to 80% at a 25 kilowatt DC charger will take about 3.5 hours, which gets cut down to 1.5 hours using a 50 kilowatt DC charger. We're told Tata Power, the charging partners for Jaguar, will install more of these soon. In a pinch, the supplied domestic plug charger fully charges the I-Pace in 48 hours, so it's best used as a top-up option.
It's a little difficult to judge whether an EV has soul, and Jaguars typically have soul. You know, they're the self-confessed bad boys of the automotive world, and as far as the I-Pace goes, it has character. I wouldn't call it the typical Jaguar character, but it's definitely got character.
At an ex-showroom price just over ₹1 crore, the I-Pace drives sporty enough to warrant the badge and is comfortable and practical enough with a longish 350km plus range to be a genuine daily drivable luxury car. While we really hope Jaguar still makes V8s for their sports cars, going by the I-Pace's capabilities, an electric everyday Jaguar that's sporty could be the dawn of a whole new era for the iconic marque.